Welcome to Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Greetings from Hamburg. I'm recording this in a small airport hotel, so if the audio sounds a bit strange, that's the reason why. The hotel room is so small I don't even have a desk and a chair. And I'm here with some other journalists to see the capabilities of the German shipbuilding company Thyssen Krupp Marine Systems, one of the two finalists for C3000, the general purpose frigate contract. But we can't actually talk about C3000 because that is against the ridiculous rules that Defence have put in place that I've mentioned before. So we're here to be briefed about the company's general capabilities and how, if it comes to pass that they win an unnamed contract in Australia, they will be able to do the work on the first three ships, which are either going to be built here or in Japan. The tour actually starts tomorrow, so I'll say as much as I can about it in the next podcast. Now, this episode is one that every 4 weeks or so crosses over with an edition of APDR, in this case June, which has a number of interesting features, including my interview with Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy, and I encourage everyone to read that. He and I touched on a number of issues, including this one of the C3000 GPF frigate, and he says the department has advised him that the rules for bidders have not changed in the last 30 years in terms of what they can communicate to the media. Minister, I have to say, of course, thank you very much for your time. I greatly appreciate it. But if that is what the department is telling you, then they are lying. In just about every competition I can think of, bidders have been perfectly free to describe what they are offering, obviously at an unclassified level. Now, here's a further scoop for all of you. The department, and I assume now the government, wants to keep all of this secret because I'm very much starting to doubt that there's any intention of building any of the chosen frigates in Australia, ever. Now, that's a pretty big allegation, and it's going to upset quite a few people, but I'll hopefully be in a position to elaborate on that in the near future. I'll return to being in Hamburg in a moment because that relates very much to another article in the current magazine, but before I do, I want to reflect on what I and some other AUKUS skeptics have been warning about for a while, namely pressure from the US on Australia to lift defence spending. I saw Richard Marles being interviewed live from Singapore just before boarding the flights over here, and he acknowledged that US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth said Australian defence spending needed to go to 3%. I've seen other reports of 5%, and 5%, that would be an extreme case and would be an indication that we are just about to go to war. It's worth remembering that US spending approaches 3.4% of its GDP on defence, so it seems kind of rich that they are asking for allies such as Australia to spend way more than that, unless you use the argument that the US has been at that amount for the last 20 years. There was a dip in the 1990s at the end of the Cold War, and we all need to catch up with that. Now, I thought it was totally hilarious last Thursday when Anthony Albanese came out and blasted the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for their analysis of our defence budget, which showed, once again, we are going backwards, which is certainly the feeling of almost all of the Australian companies I speak with, and privately some members of the department and the ADF. I've mentioned this before, but our Prime Minister has a glass jaw on anything to do with defence, and especially AUKUS, immediately snarling and snapping away like an angry little dog, a sure sign that it's a topic he's not comfortable with. At a future press conference, I'd like to see him ask 5 or 6 AUKUS questions in a row, and I wouldn't be surprised if he started foaming at the mouth at that point. Anyway, back to Australia's defence spending. Even the official figures show that if we are lucky, we will reach 2.3% of GDP in 2034, which hardly seems adequate for the most challenging circumstances since World War II that we are told we are living in. I'm interested in how US-worshipping politicians like Defence Minister Richard Marles, and he's one of the most extreme cases I've ever seen, handle the pressure from Washington. The Prime Minister has said that Australia makes its own decisions about defence expenditure. Personally, I very much doubt that, but thank you for saying that. While Richard Marles has said of Hegseth's comments that he's open to discussion about increasing expenditure. That looks to me like the Prime Minister and Defence Minister, who, for those of you who haven't noticed, is totally obsessed with being called the Deputy Prime Minister, have fundamentally different views. Do we give the US what they want or not? It seems a fairly simple yes-no question to me. If the answer is yes, then defence is going to have to spend a huge amount of extra money very quickly, and that has challenges all of its own to make sure those billions of dollars are not completely wasted, which I very much suspect will be the case unless the department is fundamentally restructured. But it will get very interesting if we say no to the Trump administration. What happens then? Donald Trump is clearly an impulsive figure, and if he decided to retaliate, how could he do it? Okay, class, the question for today. What's the one big thing that Australia is spending billions of dollars on, that entire careers have been built on over the last few years, that huge amounts of political credibility have been invested in? Class, any thoughts? Single large project, total dependence on US goodwill? Now, if you said AUKUS Pillar One and the sale to Australia of second-hand Virginia-class submarines in the 2030s, you would be correct. This is such an obvious pressure point. I see no reason why the US would not use it. They would say, lift defence spending or you don't get any Virginia-class submarines, which for operational reasons would be better left in our hands in any case. Now, a slight change of topic, future submarines, being in Hamburg, and a story in June APDR. They are all connected, and that's because we have run an article by Dr Hans Ohff, the former managing director of the Australian Submarine Corporation between 1993 and 2003, before it was imaginatively renamed ASC, and Hans was there for the absolutely critical period, a decade, when all 6 Collins-class subs were built. As it happens, I know Hans quite well, and in his article he points out a number of practical difficulties to the AUKUS Pillar One path and predicts that it will fail. I encourage everyone interested in the topic to read it. You see, unlike politicians and the vast majority of the bureaucrats and uniformed people working on AUKUS, who know absolutely nothing about project management and delivering complex systems that are heavy engineering dependent, Hans does, and so his opinions are well worth reading. The Hamburg connection is that he was born somewhere near here, and I believe retains a summer house not too far away. I won't do his entire life story now, but he is a sort of rags to riches person who, in the late 70s, I believe, set up a heavy engineering company called EGLO, E-G-L-O, which was very successful, particularly in the offshore oil and gas domain. In the mid-80s, it was purchased by another, much larger engineering powerhouse in the form of Transfield, for what I assume was a small fortune. Not that you would know that from Hans, who has never bought anyone a drink in his entire life. I knew him particularly well after 1998 when I joined the Swedish company Celsius, and we, since we owned the submarine builder Kockums, we owned 49% of the Australian Submarine Corporation. Now, Hans and I would have the occasional verbal disagreement, much to the dismay of his staff, who tended to be far more deferential than I ever was, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying this, but he's the sort of person who never has had problems whatsoever with people who stood up for themselves and their views. Anyway, typically after an hour or two of discussions, and sometimes an argument in the boardroom, there at Osborne, Hans would like nothing better than to hand out helmets and vests and go for a walk around the shipyard. Unlike the minnows who succeeded him, who would just cower in their offices with little interest in the actual work taking place. Because Hans came from a heavy engineering background, he was always totally at home in what was, and remains, a fairly blokey sort of environment with huge bits of steel being moved around, sections sometimes weighing hundreds of tons, with welders, angle grinders, noise, sparks flying everywhere, that sort of thing. Sometimes something would catch his attention and he'd wave the foreman over, and if you were in earshot, the conversation would go something like this. Hans would say, "Hey Mario," pointing to some big lump of metal, "why is that still here?" And the answer would be from Mario, "Well, Fred called in sick today and Tran is out helping in the next hall because they are short and I just can't get it done." And Hans would listen very patiently to this, sometimes asking, a few more questions, and he'd conclude with something like, "Okay, fine. But if I come back tomorrow and it's still there, I'm going to spank your bottom." Of course, they were not the actual words he used. There was always a lot of loud, good-natured vulgarity, but that's just how it was and remains in shipyards. The message was clear. I'm in charge. I know exactly what's going on here, and you had better do your job or else. Anyway, I've told that background story so you can read the article by Hans, and when he assesses that AUKUS Pillar One has almost no chance of success, people had better listen. But, of course, in Australia they won't, because it doesn't suit the political narrative. I feel it's like the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages. You had to believe that the sun rotated around the earth, or you would be burnt at the stake for disagreeing with that view. AUKUS has become sort of the third rail of Australian politics. No one dares touch it, either from the government side or the coalition side of things, because it's just become such an article of faith that it's all going to go well. And frankly, I get sick and tired of the very obvious schizophrenia between Australian ministers and government officials continuing to insist that all of the major milestones are being met, that it's all going wonderfully well, that everyone is on track. And when I contrast that with the reality, which is apparent in public in the United States, with official testimony after official testimony explaining that the US is struggling to lift the production rate of Virginia-class submarines to the level required, where they will have boats available, second-hand ones, I should say, available for sale to Australia in the early 2030s. Now, I know I've referred to this again, but to give a bit more substance to this, on April the 8th, there was a Senate Armed Services Committee hearing in Washington. The nuclear-powered subcommittee, it had a look at the 3 naval nuclear-powered programs, aircraft carriers, the new Columbia-class ballistic missile-firing submarines, and of course the Virginia-class attack submarines, SSNs, and they concluded that all 3 programs are struggling. I'll leave the aircraft carriers to one side. The Columbia-class are about 18 months late. By some measures, Virginia-class submarines are about 5 years late. And US officials keep on explaining in detail that they are really struggling because of ongoing supply chain issues, inexperienced workforces, historical underinvestments in shipyards, that sort of thing. All of the stuff in the US is available online. In Australia, the detail is being concealed from us. All that we get is this veneer of, I believe, completely false positivism. Now, that's not to say that it won't work out. I don't have that much of a crystal ball. I cannot say we will never get any second-hand Virginia-class submarines. All that I can say is that there is a possibility that we won't. And even if people would accept that it's a small possibility, it's still something I believe that defence planners should be taking into account, rather than fooling themselves, I assume, and fooling the Australian public that it's all going to work out. I think that's just a very foolish way of approaching the whole task of safeguarding Australia's security. Okay, this is a little bit shorter than normal, but I'm a little bit jet-lagged, so I'll stop here rather than just rambling. Thank you very much for listening. As I say, in the next episode, I'll reflect on what I've learnt during the visit to Thyssen Krupp Marine Systems without being able to breathe a word about C3000. If I do that, the company could be legally excluded from the competition. So we'll try and do it in general terms. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.